the form of the ontological argument that I have in mind as wanting to go over is Saint Anselm's ontological argument for the existence of God. But before we get to that, let's talk about the ontological argument in general. Right? Almost universally, the ontological argument is going to be a priori, right? It's going to be from, it's going to be pure reason, right? And it's going to be from logical premises to a logical conclusion. And more often than not, it is essentially, as I said before, proof by contradiction, or a reductio ad absurdum, where we try to show how the opposite of what we want to conclude leads us to some ridiculous conclusion, right? Some ridiculous, logically fallacious thinking, one way or another. So that's the general structure of the ontological argument. It is essentially a mathematical proof, or an attempt at a mathematical proof for the divine's existence. Now, Anslem's particular formulation itself takes the form of a dialogue between a believer and a non-believer. In fact, that's how most of his works were written. You can actually access them, like really good translations of them, by going, I believe it's, yeah, if you go to the following site, give me 1 second. Do a screen share here. Okay. So Jasper Hopkins, major figure in philosophy of religion, and also one of the most noted scholars on Anslem, St. Anselm of Canterbury, right? So the one that we're talking about here, if I recall correctly, is the Proslogogian. This is the argument in question. And most of his works take this form of, being conversations between believers and a believer and a non-believer. And he'll go through and divide it up into separate arguments that sort of contribute to the larger argument. Right. So let's go back to there. Okay. So yeah, if you go to jasperhopkins.info, jasper-hopkins.info, you can find the original text, essentially. Okay, so a little bit about Anselm really quick. He was a Benedictine monk who was promoted to Archbishop of Canterbury, and his goal, most of his work sought to connect logic, to give a logical explanations for faith, right, as a means of trying to spread the word of Christ, as it were. And he was also a Platonist, right? That means he was essentially a believer in Plato's model of the universe. And that is one of the things that Christianity as a religion has done a phenomenal job of, and that is co-opting non-religious belief sets and world explanations and transforming them in such a way as to be compatible with Christianity. Something that religions in general tend to do, but few as successfully as Christianity has done. So Plato, you'll remember his two worldview, the world of being and the world of becoming. And you have, in the world of being, is going to be more rational. It's going to be accessible to the mind. The world of becoming is this physical world and is the subject of the senses. And I mentioned it, I believe, in passing, but for Plato, he had this concept of where all the forms coalesce into one, right? The oneness from which all the individual forms emerge was called the good, right? And you have this thinker, you had St. Augustine, who was one of the early Platonists, come along, and he made three minor tweaks, right, to Plato's divided line. He kept the forms, he just changed the understanding of what they were. He kept the world of being, he just changed it to being the world of the spirit, right? So the world of the soul. And then he changed the good to God, right? Those three minor changes. And you basically get a Platonic form of the Christian worldview, where God is the source of all things. The forms, being perfect understanding, are, the understanding that God has of all things. And it's something that we have access to once we're dead and in heaven, right? According to Augustine, right? So we don't ever have full access to the forms. We only have the most partial access throughout our lives. And that's our imperfect human understanding, right? Which is why rational thought is below the forms. But that's all an aside to give you an idea of what it means to be a Christian Platonist. Right? What is important is that understanding of that Platonized understanding of God as the source of all things, right, influenced Anslem's definition of God, which is central to his ontological argument. And his definition of God is a being than which none greater can be conceived, right? So the greatest conceivable being, right? The greatest conceivable thing in existence. So what this is meant to do is be the basis for the argument that the thought that God does not exist is absurd. And this is what Anslem is trying to argue, right? That God must exist because the thought of his non-existence is ridiculous. And it's a very simple argument that breaks down into 6 simple premises, and with one kind of bare bones conclusion. Right. So the ideas. The first premise is God exists in the understanding. We can think of God. Right. And this is not going to be something that those who disagree with Anslem will, contest. What they're going to contest is the idea that the non-believer is going to contest that God exists in reality. Right? We can think of plenty of things that don't actually exist, like unicorns, or a non-corrupt politician. So the second premise, I'm letting my cynicism show. The second premise is that if something exists in the understanding, but not in reality, then something greater than it can exist, namely that object in reality. Now, remember, greatness, we're not talking about, when we talk about a thing's greatness here, we're not talking about it being good. We're talking about ontological order. Right? That we can think of something doesn't necessarily. So the thought of a unicorn ontologically is going to be of a lower status than an actual unicorn, because an actual unicorn has being, right? It has existence in a way that the thought of a unicorn doesn't. That doesn't mean that an actual unicorn would be a good thing. They're functionally murder horses, right? They've got giant bayonets sticking out of their foreheads, and they're an animal that would naturally charge if they were a predator. So, not exactly a good thing, right? Unless you're into getting gored, but that came out wrong. All right, moving on. Should note something really quick here, that the first something, right, in that premise, that second premise, if something exists, right, that first use of the word something is particular, right? It's referring to if a particular thing exists, it can be thought of, right? But doesn't exist in reality. Then something, the second something in that premise, is universal, right? So what it's saying is then anything greater than it can exist, as long as it actually exists. My glasses are ontologically greater than any unicorn, because I can think of a unicorn, but these glasses actually exist. So there's sort of a hidden premise at work here, that existence makes something a greater. Greater. And that applies here because it's an ontological argument, and that's important. Okay, so premise 3. Suppose God does not exist in reality. So suppose that God is something that we can only think of. He doesn't actually exist. Well, then we're forced to conclude that something greater ontologically than God, the greatest thing, can exist. This is just logical follow-through from premises 1, 2, and 3. And now here we substitute that definition of God that Anslem had as a being than which none greater can be conceived, right? So we take that fourth premise and we just substitute the definition for God in place of God, right? So what we're saying essentially is that something greater than a being than which none greater can be conceived can exist. And this is clearly a contradiction. You can't have something greater than the greatest possible thing, right? So, which means that the third premise, God doesn't exist in reality, must be false. Because the only way for God, the most perfect being, to be greater than the mere thought of him is for him to exist in reality. There's, do you follow? Just really quick. Like, it's ultimately a simple argument, but there's a lot that goes on in it. One of the things that goes on in it that we can raise as an objection to this formulation of the ontological argument is that it treats existence as a property of a thing, right? Similar to, something being powerful or red or metal, right? But this says precisely nothing about the thing it is a part of, right? To treat existence in this way doesn't actually tell us anything about the thing, or in this case, about God. If existence was a property, like being red or being metal is, then existence would be something that was optional or contingent of an object. But the fact of the matter is, we can only say that something is red or metal by dint of the fact that it exists to make those sort of, I'm blanking on the word, observations of. So if it was a property of, if God's existence was a property of God, the same way that red is the or the blue, color blue is a property of my water bottle, then what we're saying is that it could exist or not. Right? This water bottle could be a different color. There's every possibility that it could have been something else. But talking about existence that way doesn't make sense. The redness of the apple or the woodenness of a bookcase is quite different from existence, which isn't something that can or cannot be of an object. The object just either is or isn't. It does exist or it doesn't. Right? And in existing, it can be any number of other things, but first the object has to exist. And that's kind of all that there is to it. So to argue for existence of a being from the ontological point of view is to argue that existence is a property. And as a separate issue, is existence a property of an object is something that a lot of metaphysicians have spent, I want to say, the last 70 years actually debating. Like, it's been an actual debate in metaphysics. But because it's a debate, we can raise that as an objection from one school of thought that would say that existence isn't a property. So the ontological argument falls short in that regard, since it treats it as one.